Hello, I'm Roy Branson, and I am working with you this quarter on a course about Adventism and Health, or the actual title is The Saga of Adventists and Healthcare. I realized at the end of the introductory speech or talk that we had together concerning this course that I had asked you folks, as you see in the course requirements, if you were willing to send me a picture and to talk a little bit about yourself, and I had not done that. So I thought that I would start here by talking about myself. I hope that that's a sufficient justification or excuse for talking about me, but it does seem to me that you deserve to have a sense as to what my perspective is when I talk to you about these kinds of topics, which we both think are significant, right? All right. I'm Roy Branson, and I am the Associate Dean of the School of Religion at Loma Linda University and also Director of the Center for Christian Bioethics here at Loma Linda. I grew up in the family of an Adventist preacher and leader in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, conference president, union president, and particularly growing up in my earliest years in Egypt, in Cairo, and also in Beirut, Lebanon. Very interesting, very rich. It was exceedingly exciting for me as well as for the other members of my family. So my roots are deep within the Adventist Church. My grandparents on both sides were Adventists, leaders, and lots of my uncles were preachers, and many of my aunts were married to preachers. I grew up, as far as school is concerned, in Greater New York Conference, went to Atlantic Union College all 4 years, majored in English, and then got a master's degree at the University of Chicago. Went from there to the Seventh-day Adventist Seminary and got a master's degree in religion, and from there spent 7 years, that's right, 7 long years at Harvard University getting a PhD in religious ethics. It was during that time when I was in graduate school that I really started looking at Adventist history seriously. Why? That was the time when the civil rights movement, led by Martin Luther King Jr., burst upon the United States. It had been developing over a long period of time, of course. I found that out later. But there were lots of demonstrations going on in Boston, and the question was, as a person who was studying religion, was planning to be hired by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, would I participate? Was it right for me to participate? I certainly started in Boston, walking, marching. Some of my fellow Adventist graduate students did not, but I made that decision. Then I had to face the question of whether I was going to interrupt my graduate studies a little bit by marching in Selma in Alabama. And that also raised the question, if I did that, would I be in violation of the Adventist tradition? And so that began my study of the Adventist history and its attitude towards all kinds of things like civil rights, like social issues of all sorts. After all, I was studying ethics and was writing on ethics, and so what was the Adventist tradition on a variety of topics? At that time, it was civil rights. I went from, after getting my doctorate, to the seminary at Andrews University, where I started the ethics program, and was also editing, or beginning to edit, Spectrum magazine. Now, Spectrum magazine is another whole story, but it's an independent but deeply committed Adventist journal. It still exists. And it became an outlet for a lot of young historians at that time who were trained at some of the best universities in the country to do history and began looking at their own tradition. And that was in the 70s and 80s a real efflorescence of historical studies on Adventism. This was also a time when I began to wonder whether we had misread some of our early history. I had grown up thinking that we shouldn't participate in these demonstrations. I had obviously gone past that, but when I wrote an article about some of the early Adventists being activists on abolition, indeed the denominational paper, the Review and Herald, published an essay saying, well, we really shouldn't participate. And so it became a long examination of what is our attitude towards all kinds of social issues. And one of the things that we are finding in this course, or I'm sharing with you in this course, is that actually we had different views on that question, whether or not the church should be involved in various social matters or not. And that is something we'll be looking at as we go through the various stages of Adventism that are outlined in that chart that has been given to you and that you have access to. Let me today focus on the early period, in fact, the earliest Adventist to be a healthcare reformer. He was a boy of 14, living just outside of New Bedford, Massachusetts, a place called Fairhaven that at one time had been a part of New Bedford, Massachusetts. It was the best and also largest whaling port in the United States. It was known for being a whaling port. The father of this teenager, 14, had been a captain in the Revolutionary Army. Indeed, when General Lafayette, who had been a major assistant general to Washington, came back and visited the United States, he came to Boston. Captain Bates went to this reception, and Lafayette immediately said, "Oh, Captain Bates, you were under my immediate command in the Revolutionary War." People around asked him, what's going on? You really knew him? And the general explained that indeed he was one of his lieutenants. The son did become a leader as his father became. By the way, the father became, after the Revolutionary War, a founder of an academy in Fairhaven, New Bedford, Fairhaven, and was the superintendent of its construction. He no doubt expected that his son would become an educator as well. But the son, Joseph Bates, was fascinated by what he saw in New Bedford at that time, where there were all of these people involved in whaling. Now, George Knight, who has been for many years was the head of the history department at the seminary, says that indeed this Joseph Bates grew up to be not just a founder, but he claims the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination. He says that's because Joseph Bates introduced the Sabbath to Adventists. He converted many of the leaders of the first generation of people who led the Seventh-day Adventist movement, people like James and Ellen White, S.N. Haskell, R.F. Cottrell, John Byington, who is reputed to have been a part of the Underground Railroad. Whether or not he was the first president of the General Conference. And he was Adventism's first health reformer. Now, we'll be looking at why George Knight says that, because it's directly relevant to what we're talking about here. But I want to look at the story of Joseph Bates because I think that it shows how an individual whom George Knight, for one, says was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, exemplifies the way in which Adventism is a part of the American saga, the way in which Adventism is concerned about history, the way in which Adventism is concerned not only about the future, but also about the past. And also how Adventism relies so deeply on biblical metaphors. Now, a lot of people look at Adventism and health and they think of principles. You've heard of health principles, healthful living principles. But I want it in this quarter to be a saga, a story, an account of great actions by colorful people that made a difference, not only in their lives, and not only in the lives of those who are just around them, but in the lives of America. Now that may seem like a stretch to you, but that's what we're going to try to do in this quarter. Why in the world did Joseph Bates, the son of a captain, clearly a professional man, and an educator, decide that he wanted to, what we would call, run away to the sea? Well, one way to get a glimpse of that and a sense as to how his emotions could go in that direction is to look at what is called one of the great sagas of America, Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Moby Dick, why? Because Moby Dick is set, it was written about 20 years after a lot of what was going on with, in fact, more than 20 years later than Joseph Bates. But it was set, a lot of it, in the beginning of that account, was set in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And in the early chapters of this great saga of American literature, there's a description that I would like to read to you of what it was like to walk around the streets of New Bedford. The walks that Joseph Bates took as a teenager. In thoroughfares nigh the docks, says Melville, and I'll be reading quite a bit from Melville here, you see only sailors. But in New Bedford, actual cannibals stand chatting at street corners. Besides the Fijians, Tonga Tabors, Aromangoans, Panagoan, and Brigidians, and I'm sure I've mispronounced those, and besides the wild specimens of the whaling craft, which unheeded reel about the streets, there weekly arrive scores of equally strange people, green Vermonters and New Hampshire men, all athirst for gain and glory in the fishery. Now, in addition to these whalers from all over the world that would come to New Bedford and which made the streets of this little port, although for Massachusetts it was a pretty good sized port, but not in terms of London or other ports around the world. But it made this an exotic place. But in addition to that, this, after all, was New England. This was the place where the Puritans had landed. And religion continued to be important, and it continued to be important for a great American writer like Herman Melville. And he conveyed it by talking about religion in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Joseph Bates' hometown. He talks about going to the Whaleman's Chapel. I won't take the time to describe his marvelous description of the Whaleman's Chapel, but I can't resist talking about a pulpit that is in the Whaleman's Chapel, according to Melville. And in this pulpit, there is not a stairs to get up into this elevated pulpit from which the preacher looks down and gives a sermon to those gathered on the floor of the chapel. Oh no, there's a side ladder, the kind of ladder that you climb up to get into a ship. And Father Maple, after gaining the height, slowly turned round and, stooping over the pulpit, deliberately dragged up the ladder, step by step, leaving him impregnable in his little Quebec. You know, of course, that Quebec is a fortress on a hill. The Holy Bible rested on a projecting piece of scrollwork fashioned after a ship's fiddle-headed beak. In other words, it's a fish beak that looks like the head of a fiddle. And then he goes on. What could be more full of meaning? For the pulpit is ever this earth's foremost part. All the rest comes in its rear. The pulpit leads the world. From thence it is the storm of God's quick wrath is first decried, and the bow must bear the earliest brunt. From thence it is the God of breezes, fair or foul, is first invoked for favorable winds. Yes, notice this phrase. It is marvelous, and it shows how important that Calvinist religion still was in New England. Yes, the world's a ship on its passage out, and not a voyage complete. And the pulpit is its prow. Now, it's not just spiritual experience on the part of somebody out in the woods. This is institutionalized religion that is the prow of the ship. And then he gives a sermon. And what is this Father Maple, who was a whaleman and a harpooner at that, and he's become a preacher? What's his sermon? I think you figured it out. It's about Jonah. And there's this long sermon in this book by Melville. And it's preached in the midst of a storm, with all the thunder and the lightning flashing through the windows of this chapel. And it reveals that for people who were the leaders of culture of America, like Herman Melville, they were fascinated by the world, all those harpoonists coming in from different parts of the world, but they were also still committed to Scripture. And not only Scripture, but they were committed to the metaphors of Scripture. And they saw those metaphors as a connection between them and tradition, all the way back to the Hebrews. They also saw the metaphors as a connection with the cosmos. And so metaphors are central to this saga of Adventists in America having to do with health. The summation or climax of this sermon about Jonah, according to Melville, and he depicts Maple as looking up from his pulpit, although I'll be looking down to read to you what he says. A deep joy in his eyes as he cried out with a heavenly enthusiasm, "But oh, shipmates, on the starboard hand of every woe, there is a sure delight, and higher the top of that delight," top of the sails. "Delight is to him whose strong arms yet support him, when the ship of this base treacherous world has gone down beneath him. Top gallant delight, the very topsail, is to him who acknowledges no law or Lord but the Lord his God, and is only a patriot to heaven. Delight is to him whom all the waves of the billows of the seas, the boisterous mob, can never shake from this sure keel of the ages." Now, you know what a keel is on a ship, right? It's what keeps it balanced because of it's going down under the ship. Happily, Joseph Bates wrote an autobiography. So we have a sense as to the events beyond New Bedford that helped to shape this leader of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who was a health reformer before the other leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was a health reformer before he got involved with the Millerite movement. And so what we are achieving by focusing on Joseph Bates is to see how health reform took some people like Joseph Bates into the anticipation of that enormous reform of the second coming of Christ. Next week, we'll be talking about how do people who believe in the second coming of Christ get to health reform. But again, right now, we want to go back to Joseph Bates, a person who was shaped by the economy, by the culture of his time, to be a sailor. And I do want to spend a little time talking about some of his amazing adventures. And I suggest also that apart from this course or during this course, you take a look and go online and try to find the autobiography of Joseph Bates. And it is one amazing event after another. When he was 14, he went away and really didn't come back for about 5 years, because this was a time when there was fighting between England and the United States over what was going to happen at sea, who was going to dominate at sea, and so on. And many of those years he was taken by the British Navy off of a ship and was told that he had to fight with the British Navy. And they forced him sometimes, but there were times when he refused. And finally they threw him into a ship that was a prison ship. He and others tried to get out of that ship and escape. He did escape, but then he was caught again and taken to Dartmoor prison in England. And he was kept there for about 4 years. During that time, Captain Bates, the father, wrote a letter off to James Madison demanding that James Madison free his son. But eventually he was released and he was able to go back to New Bedford. He shipped out again and eventually became the captain of a ship. It took a while. He was the first mate and then he was the captain. And he had enormous numbers of experiences all the way from Archangel in Russia, and as I said before, around Cape Horn to Peru. And he participated in what were called mutinies, taking ships away from some captains when he was just on his way up. And then he faced possible mutinies from other people on his ship, and so on. But after a while, he started reading on these long ship rides. And he gradually started thinking about religious thoughts. He had gotten married. His wife left him a poem in a Bible, and he read the poem. So in 1821, he vows never to drink another glass of grog or strong drink while I live. And that was how he started approaching spirituality, was with these practical actions having to do with health. In 1822, the next year, he vows not to drink any more wine, which he had continued to allow himself to have. 23, he gives up chewing tobacco and tossed the tobacco, he says, into the ocean, never to touch, taste, or handle it anymore. 1824, he gives up beer and fermented cider, and then all alcoholic drinks. So there are all of these ways in which he gives up things that he thinks are polluting him and that go contrary to what God would want. Finally, in 1824, he has what he called a solemn covenant with God, in which he promised to serve him the remainder of my life. He also, that year, gives up coffee. So the whole approach of Joseph Bates to his God are steps in health reform. Finally, in 1826, he attends a revival meeting while he's on shore. 1827, he's baptized by immersion into what was called the Christian Church or the Christian Connection. This is a very, very important step because he gets to know several other people who are pastors in the Christian Connection, and among those are people who get involved with William Miller. Finally, he gets a ship, and this time he makes a huge difference about what's happening on this ship. 15 miles out to sea, he announces to his crew, oh, by the way, this is a temperance ship. And for Joseph Bates, temperance meant abstinence, total abstinence. So he had to tell, and was delighted to tell, although they were not delighted to hear it, to tell his crew that they were on a ship with no liquor on board at all. The next year, he stays home for good. And from that time on, he begins to pour his life into not only the work of the Christian Connection or the Christian Church, but also other kinds of good works, reform works, because health reform, as we will come back to over and over again, health reform was a part of all kinds of reforms. One of the first things that he got involved in when he got on shore was to help the seamen and set up an outreach to the seamen. He also set up a farm for young people. He became a part of educational reform. He had an amazing idea that he would get mulberry trees and get these students to take care of the mulberry trees, and then by selling these selling the little animals, caterpillars that became silkworms, then these students could earn money and they could stay in school. So what we see with Joseph Bates is a person who is excited by the incredible expansion of America. Later in the century, of course, there would be the clipper ships that didn't stop until the Suez Canal was dug and was being used. And he was also moved by moral reform and social reform, including health reform. One of the themes and metaphors that's very important is not only looking to the future to see how this country could be better, but there's also the metaphor of change, which you'll notice is very important for Joseph Bates. He's constantly wanting to change from bad to good. And he's also moving from individual experience to changing the community around him. I don't know that he was really terribly self-conscious about that, but as a man of affairs, as a person who was a very good professional, in his case, running ships, he just was thrown into working with other people. And that's how the form that his religion took. And then, of course, the biblical metaphors were important. And you'll notice that this whole course is organized by biblical metaphors having to do with health. The temple, which I mentioned to you with the introductory lecture, which conveys to anybody who takes temple imagery seriously the idea that the person who's in the temple should be pure. And then the biblical metaphor of law or covenant, where one makes promises to God, and because of those promises, there's certain actions that are appropriate and some that are not. And health care is one of those ways in which we act appropriately. And then finally, there is the metaphor of the healing of the nations. Sometimes this metaphor is a kind of military metaphor, the great cosmic battle between good and evil. And that certainly appears among the Millerites and the Adventists. But it also can be a cosmic healing, which we will come to in due course during this quarter. Now, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the requirements. You, of course, will want to look at the course outline and the course objectives and the course requirements. And you will see that the central requirement of this quarter is to read and to write, pretty basic stuff. And there are going to be 9 essays, 600 to 800 words, and then there is a final, not an exam, but a final essay of 1,500 to 1,800 words. And that is a summation. And that's something that you'll be needing to talk with me about as you come to decide what topic you'll want to explore at that length. Or you can instead spend 5 hours in advocacy and then put together a portfolio as indicated in your course requirements, including an essay, 600 to 800 word essay. I want to underscore for you the fact that these essays are not simply reaction pieces. I was moved by this to feel so and so. No, you have to look at what is in the reading and try to figure out the central thesis or sub-theses supporting the main thesis, some analysis of the reading for your essay. And I would encourage you very strongly to outline what you're going to say. Even if it's a short essay, outline. Why? Because it's only with outlining that you can give proportions, that you can say, okay, I'm going to devote these many words to this point and this many words to that point. Otherwise, there is a possibility that you'll not have a match between the number of words and the importance of your point. So outline and notice the proportions. It's always a good idea to give your thesis at the beginning, the main point at the beginning, and repeat it at the end, but please take care to outline. Now, the first essay that you're going to be reading is one that I've written, and we're going to be looking at how the community that was keeping the Sabbath and was concerned about the second coming, how that community moved from being Millerites to what we now call Seventh-day Adventists. And it's going to be important that we look at that to have a sense as to the scope of what we're talking about when we talk about health. It's even important to figure out this move from Millerites to Seventh-day Adventists to see any point at all for healthcare institutions and for the kind of activities that Joseph Bates got himself involved in terms of health reform. So you'll be looking at Scripture and some shifts that go on in Scripture. I'm talking about, of course, the New Testament. And then a parallel kind of shifts I'm suggesting when you move from the Millerites and the Great Disappointment on into the Seventh-day Adventists. I do hope that we have a good time. I anticipate that we will. And though I grew up, as I said before, thinking that health was a collection of principles and healthcare was something that went on in a hospital only, I think that if we really understand our heritage, we'll see that health is broader than that, and healthcare is also broader than that. Thank you, and we'll be back again in a week. Bye.